Okay, you are on the clock,
Okay.
madame.
As we heard in the earlier pavilion, President Reagan desired very much to give his life to combating communism and reducing nuclear proliferation after the assassination attempt. He tried to have correspondence with the leaders of the Soviet world, but they kept dying on him. Eventually, he was able to communicate with President Gorbachev behind the scenes and work towards having a meeting with him. And the first meeting here, you'll come this way, you'll see in 1985, so in his second term in office, he was able to meet with President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union to try and cool down the Cold War that was happening. As you can see from his countenance, their countenance, they are happy men right now. They are getting along, they are forming a relationship, and this is at a lakeside house, away from the diplomats, away from all the politicians, to get to know each other as President Reagan believed in face-to-face diplomacy. Out of this particular summit came an agreement to have a cultural exchange. Under President Carter in 1979, they eliminated any kind, because the Soviets had invaded Afghanistan, they eliminated the exchange of ballerinas and dancers and musicians and athletes, and that was the start of building friendships between the two countries. They would exchange these type of people. Also, what came out of this summit in 1985 was, let's have a second summit. So over here, we have a display from the second summit, which was, as you heard earlier, to reduce nuclear arms, but we had the SDI treaty, the SDI Star Wars technology, and President Gorbachev said at the very last minute, unless you remove that from the table, unless you stop the SDI program, we will not go forward with reducing our arms. That made President Reagan very upset, and as you can see here, he has a countenance that he's very sad. He said this meeting is over, and he walked out. This will be one of 3 pictures within the museum that you'll see that he has a sad face. Okay, out of this one more thing, here is the treaty that was signed for the cultural exchange, and this is a picture of Ambassador Rui, who was the ambassador to Iceland, and he has a patio outside named after him, which you will see the Berlin Wall a little later on. Following kind of the cooling of this summit, President Reagan in 1987 went to Berlin, and he made the very famous Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. The politicians behind President Reagan didn't believe that he should be so confrontational, but he stuck to his grounds. As you've heard before, he's a man of his word. He meant what he said, and he publicly, across the world, confronted President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. Here is a copy of that speech that he said in front of the Brandenburg Gate, which is an iconic symbol of communism, and in front of the Berlin Wall. Coming this way, you'll see where they met then finally. 3 months later, President Gorbachev was willing to sit down again with President Reagan, and this is the big summit where they finally agreed to reduce nuclear arms by 50% with the INF agreement. There were state dinners, which you saw earlier in the White House. There was a lot of pomp and circumstance between both presidents and their wives, and here they are beautifully shaking hands. They have formed a relationship. While they didn't always agree on everything, they were truly men who respected one another and were able to work together. Finally, they signed the INF agreement. This is the pen that President Gorbachev used to sign it. The one that President Reagan used is presumably on display in Russia. And then President Reagan and Mrs. Reagan went to Moscow to actually sign the agreement with President Gorbachev. At this summit also, President Reagan was able to go to campuses, Red Square, and other places and make some speeches telling the people what freedom is about, telling young people so that they wouldn't buy into the propaganda that was being put forth by the Soviets. Finally, I would encourage you to come back, see the video that explains everything that had happened during these years. This is a beautiful statue of the 2 presidents sitting together, which just shows you the camaraderie that they had, but it was all started with peace through strength that President Reagan believed in.
Okay.
Wow.